Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Reading Rainbows, where we're reading Inkheart by Cornelia Funke, and today we are reading Chapter 42, A Furry Face on the Windowsill. It's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards. Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. I wish I had a memory that worked forwards as well as backwards, but what can you do? Flatnose brought Meggie and Finoglio their breakfast, and this morning it was more than bread and a few olives. He put a basket of fruit on the table for them and a plate of small sweet cakes, but Meggie didn't at all like the smile he served up at the same time. "All for you, princess," he grunted, pinching her cheek with his clumsy fingers, "to strengthen your little voice. There's been a lot of excitement since Basta told us about the execution. Well, like I always said, there has to be more to life than hanging up a few dead roosters and shooting cats." "Don't shoot cats! No! Bad!" Meggie exchanged a glance with Finoglio. The old man was staring at Flatnose with an expression of disgust that suggested he couldn't believe such a creature had slipped from his pen. "Yes, to be sure, it's been a terribly long time since we had a nice execution," continued Flatnose on his way back to the door. "It'd attract too much attention, they always said, and when someone really had to disappear, well, the word was to go carefully, make it look like an accident. Is that any fun? You bet it isn't. Not like it used to be. A good execution with eating and drinking and dancing and music. That's the way to do it in style. And so we will this time, just like we did back in the good old days." Finoglio took a sip of the black coffee that Flatnose had brought him and choked. "Don't you fancy that kind of thing, Grandpa?" Flatnose looked at him sneeringly. "Take my word for it, Capricorn's executions are something to remember." "Who do you think you're telling?" muttered Finoglio unhappily. Yeah, this brings up a whole issue of, if an author was writing a book knowing that it was possible for someone to read the characters out of the book, would they then alter their writing so that there wasn't anyone so truly horrendous as Capricorn and his men, or Voldemort, or, any number of other villains? Yeah, and if they did alter their writing, would it then be as interesting? Yeah, I mean, imagine a world where there weren't books with these sorts of villains in them. Yeah, sure, the occasional book without a big, truly horrendous villain is okay. But think of all the great books out there. And think of all the ones that have, an antagonist that is just truly captivating and all that. And just trying to think of how I want to word this. Imagine that those books did not exist. Or if they existed, they'd be so much watered down to keep their villains from being such horrendous bad guys. You get what I mean? Yeah. Would you still like those books if they didn't have those characters? Would you still like Harry Potter if there wasn't a Voldemort? Just something to think on a little. At that moment, someone knocked on the door. Flatnose had left it ajar, and Darius the reader put his head around it. "Sorry," he breathed, looking at Flatnose as anxiously as a bird obliged to get close to a hungry cat. I'm to get the girl to read something aloud. Capricorn's orders." "Really? Well, let's just hope she reads something useful out of a book this time. Basta showed me the fairy. She doesn't even sprinkle any fairy dust, however hard you shake her." Flatnose looked at Meggie with a mixture of dislike and respect. Perhaps he thought she was some kind of a witch. "Knock when you want to come out again," he he grunted, pushing past Darius. Darius nodded and stood there for a moment before sitting down at the table with Meggie and Finoglio, looking embarrassed. He stared greedily at the fruit until Finoglio pushed the basket over to him. Tentatively, he took an apricot and put it in his mouth as if he thought he would never in his life taste anything so delicious again. "Good heavens, it's only an apricot," laughed Finoglio. "Not exactly a rare fruit in these latitudes." Darius spat the apricot stone out into his hand, still looking awkward. "Whenever they shut me up in this room," he said timidly, "they gave me nothing but dry bread, and they took my books away too, but I managed to hide some of them, and when the hunger got too bad, I looked at the pictures in them. The best was a picture of apricots. I sometimes sat for hours staring at the painted fruit with my mouth watering. Ever since then, I just can't control myself when I see apricots." Meggie took another apricot from the basket and put it into his hand. "Did they often shut you up?" she asked. The thin little man shrugged. "Yes, whenever I didn't read something out of a book properly," he replied evasively. "Well, that meant all the time, really. Then they finally gave up because they realized that my reading didn't exactly improve when they frightened me. On the contrary. Take Flatnose, for instance." He lowered his voice, casting a nervous glance at the door. "I read Flatnose out while Basta was standing beside me with his knife. Well," he raised his narrow shoulders regretfully. Why do bad guys think that intimidating someone will get them to work better? Yeah, trying to scare the crap out of someone isn't going to be helpful. Yeah, if anything, it just makes the performance worse, but for whatever reason, they still think that sitting there threatening you with a knife and whatever is the way to get you to perform properly. It's stupid. Meggie looked at him sympathetically. Then she asked hesitantly, "Did you ever read any women out of that story?" Finoglio looked at her uneasily. "Certainly," Darius replied. "I read Mortola out of the book. She says I made her older and as rickety as a chair cobbled together badly, but I really don't think I got too much wrong with her. Luckily, Capricorn agreed." "Any younger women?" Meggie was looking at neither Darius nor Finoglio. "Oh yes," Darius sighed. "On the same day as I read Mortola out. I remember it very well. Capricorn was living up in the north then, at a lonely, half-ruined farm in the mountains, and there weren't many local girls around. I myself was living not far away, in my sister's house. I worked as a teacher, but in my free time I read aloud now and then in libraries and schools, or for children's parties, and sometimes on warm summer evenings I even read in a square or cafe. I loved reading aloud." His gaze wandered to the window, as if he could catch a glimpse there of those long-forgotten, happier days. "I think Boston noticed me when I was reading aloud at a party in the village, a passage from Dr. Dolittle, and all of a sudden there was a bird flying around. I really didn't know I had the gift. Perhaps it was something to do with Basta being there. Anyway, when I went home, Basta caught me as if I were a stray dog and took me to Capricorn. First he made me read Gold out of the books, like your father did," he said, smiling sadly at Meggie. But then I had to read Mortola out for him, and after that he told me to read his maidservants out too. It was terrible." Darius pushed his glasses up on his nose with trembling fingers. "I was so scared. How can you read aloud well when you're terrified? He made me try 3 times. Oh, I felt so sorry for them. I don't want to talk about it." He buried his face in his hands, which were as bony as an old man's. Maggie thought she heard him sob, and for a moment she hesitated to ask her next question, but then she did. All right, just hold on a moment. He would read aloud for birthday parties? I would have loved a birthday party that was centered around books and, have someone come in and read aloud and all that. I would have loved that, but I would have been called a nerd and ostracized even worse than I was already. Where can I go that this is an acceptable an acceptable party thing? That's awesome. Excuse me. The maid they call Risa, she said, her heart beating in her mouth. Was she one of them? Darius took his hands away from his face. Yes, she came out quite by chance, he said huskily. Capricorn had really wanted another of them, but suddenly there was Risa, and at first I thought I'd got it right for once. She looked so beautiful, almost improbably beautiful, with her golden hair and her sad eyes. But then we realized she couldn't speak. Well, that didn't bother Capricorn. In fact, I think he liked it. He searched his pants pocket and brought out a crumpled handkerchief. I really could read better once, he said, sniffing. But this constant fear, may I? With a sad smile, he took another apricot and bit into it. Then he wiped the juice from his mouth with his sleeve, cleared his throat, and gazed straight at Maggie. His eyes looked curiously large behind the thick lenses of his glasses. At the festivities the Capricorn's planning, he said, lowering his gaze and running his finger awkwardly along the edge of the table. The idea, as you probably know, is for you to read from Inkheart. The book's being kept in a secret place until that time comes. Only Capricorn knows where it is, so you won't see it before the occasion. Which means that we're to use another book for the latest test Capricorn wants of your talents. Luckily, there are a few other books in this village, not many, but anyway, I've been told to choose something suitable. He raised his head again and gave a small slight smile. Fortunately, I didn't have any... Fortunately, I didn't have to look for gold in such treasures this time. All Capricorn wants is proof of your skill, and so, he said, pushing a small book over the table, so I chose this one. Maggie bent over the cover. Collected Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen, she read aloud. She looked at Darius. They're beautiful stories. Yes, he breathed, sad, but very, very beautiful. Reaching over the table, he opened the book for Maggie at a place that he had marked with a couple of long blades of grass slipped between the yellowed pages. First I thought of my favorite story, the one about the nightingale. Maybe you know it? Maggie nodded. But the fairy you read out of the book yesterday isn't happy in the jug where Basta has put her, Darius went on. So I thought it might be better if you tried the tin soldier. The tin soldier. Maggie did not reply at once. The brave tin soldier in his little paper boat. She imagined him suddenly appearing beside the fruit basket. No, she said. No, I've told Capricorn already. I won't read anything out of a book for him, not even as a test. Tell him I can't do it anymore. Just tell him I tried and nothing came out of the story. Darius gave her a sympathetic look. Oh, I would, he said quietly. Really, I would. But it's the magpie, he said quickly, putting his hand to his mouth as if he'd said too much. Sorry, I mean the housekeeper, of course, Signora Mortola. It's her you have to read aloud to. I've only chosen the story. The magpie, an image of her flashed into Maggie's mind, watching her with her bird-like eyes. Suppose I bite my tongue, she thought, very hard. She had done that a few times by mistake, and once her tongue had swelled up so much she had to talk to Mo in sign language for 2 days. She looked at Finoglio for help. Alright, have you ever tried to purposely bite your tongue? Like, I'm sure you've accidentally bitten your tongue, and you know the sort of pain that it comes from. Have you ever tried to purposely bite it? It's nearly impossible to actually do it hard enough to hurt on purpose. So I don't think Maggie's plan to bite her tongue would work too well. "Do it," he said to her surprise. "Read aloud to the old woman, but make a condition that you can keep the tin soldier. Tell her anything you like. Say you want to play with him because you're bored to death. And then ask for something else. Some sheets of paper and a pencil. Say you want to draw pictures, understand? If she agrees, we'll take it from there." Maggie didn't understand a word of this, but before she could ask Finoglio what he was planning, the door opened, and there was the magpie herself. Darius leaped to his feet so quickly at the sight of her that he pushed Maggie's plate off the table. I'm sorry, so sorry," he stammered, picking up the broken pieces in his bony fingers. He cut his thumb so deeply on the last piece that blood dripped to the wooden floorboards. "Get up, you fool!" snapped Mortola. "Have you shown her what she's to read from?" Darius nodded and looked unhappily at his bleeding thumb. "Then get out! You can help the women in the kitchen. There are chickens to be plucked." Darius made a face, looked disgusted, but he bowed and disappeared into the corridor, but not without casting Maggie a last sympathetic glance. "Okay," said the magpie, waving to her impatiently. "Start reading, and put your mind to it." Maggie read the tin soldier out of the story. It was as if he simply fell from the ceiling. He dropped down 3 stories to the street, and his bayonet stuck in the earth between 2 cobblestones. The magpie reached for him before Maggie could, and stared at him as if he were just a painted toy, while he looked back at her with horror in his eyes. Then she put him in the pocket of her coarse-knit woolen jacket. "Please, can I have him?" stammered Maggie, just as the magpie reached the doorway. Finoglio placed himself behind her as if to cover her back, but the magpie just looked at Maggie with her sharp-nosed gaze. I mean, there's nothing you'd want to do with him," Maggie went on uncertainly, "and I'm so bored, please." The magpie looked at her unmoved. "You can have him back when Capricorn has seen him," she said, and then she was gone. "The paper!" cried Finoglio. "You forgot to ask for paper and pencil." "I'm sorry," murmured Maggie. She hadn't forgotten. It was just that she didn't dare ask the magpie for anything else. "Oh, well, I'll just have to get it by other means," said Finoglio. "The only question is, how?" Maggie went over to the window, rested her forehead on the pane, and looked down at the garden, where a couple of Capricorn's maids were busy tying up tomato plants. What would Mo say, she wondered, if he knew I can do it too? "Who did you read out, Maggie? Poor Tinkerbell and the steadfast tin soldier?" "Yes," murmured Maggie, tracing an invisible M on the pane with her finger. "Poor fairy, poor tin soldier, poor dust finger, and—" She thought again of the woman with the dark blonde hair. "Risa," she whispered. "Teresa. Teresa was her mother's name." She was about to turn away from the window when, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something appearing above the sill outside. A small furry face. Maggie retreated in alarm. "Do rats climb walls?" Yes, but that wasn't a rat. The animal's muzzle wasn't pointed enough. She quickly ran back to the window pane. Gwyn. The marten was sitting on the narrow sill, looking in at her with sleepy eyes. "Basta," muttered Finoglio behind her. "Yes, Basta will get me the paper. That's a good idea." Maggie opened the window very slowly so that Gwyn wouldn't take fright and perhaps fall off the sill. Even a marten would break all his bones if he fell into the paved yard from this height. She put out her hand, still very slowly. Her fingers trembled as she stroked Gwyn's back. Then she grabbed him before his little teeth could snap at her and quickly lifted him into the room. She looked anxiously down, but none of the maids had noticed anything. They were all bending over the vegetable patch, their clothes drenched with perspiration from the heat of the sun burning down on their backs. And, I'm sorry, but even if they did notice something, it would be at such a distance that, would they really realize that it was Gwyn? And that, Maggie was pulling Gwyn into there? Or, would they just look up, see, a furry shape disappearing into a window? You know what I mean? Like, I get that Maggie's paranoid, but I think that she's a little excessively paranoid. There was a note under Gwyn's collar. It was dirty and had been folded very small and tied in place with a piece of tape. "Why are you opening the window? The air outside is even hotter than in here. Finoglio broke off and stared in amazement at the animal in Maggie's arms. She quickly put a warning finger to her lips. Then, holding the struggling Gwyn tight, she removed the note from under his collar. The marten chattered crossly and snapped at her finger again. He didn't like being held too long and would even bite Dustfinger if he tried it. "What have you got there, a rat?" Finoglio came closer. Maggie let go of the marten, and Gwyn immediately leaped back to the windowsill. "A marten?" cried an astonished Finoglio. "Where did that come from?" Maggie looked anxiously at the door, but obviously the guard outside had heard nothing. Finoglio pressed his hand to his mouth and looked at Gwyn, and looked again at Gwyn in such amazement that Maggie almost laughed. "He's got horns," he whispered. "Of course, that's the way you wrote him," she whispered back. Gwyn was still sitting on the windowsill, blinking uncomfortably at the sun. He didn't like bright light and preferred to sleep through the day, so how had he got here? Maggie put her hand out of the window, but there was still only the maids down in the yard. Hastily she moved back into the room and unfolded the note. "A message?" Finoglio leaned over her shoulder. "Is it from your father?" Maggie nodded. She had recognized the writing at once, although it wasn't as steady as usual. Her heart began dancing inside her. She traced the letters with her eyes as longingly as if they were a path with Mo waiting for her at the end of it. "What on earth does it say? I can't make out a word of it," whispered Finoglio. Maggie smiled. "It's Elvish writing," she whispered. "Mo and I have been using it as our secret writing ever since I read The Lord of the Rings. But he's probably rather out of practice. He's made quite a lot of mistakes." "Well, what does it say?" Maggie read it to him. "Farid? Who's he?" "A boy. Mo read him out of the 1001 Nights, but that's another story." "Ha ha, another story." "You saw him. When Dustfinger ran away from you, Farid was with him." Maggie folded the note up again and looked out of the window once more. One of the maids had straightened up. She was brushing the earth off her hands and looking up at the high wall as if she dreamed of flying away over it. Who had brought Gwyn here? Mo? Or had the marten found his way by himself? That was most unlikely. He certainly wouldn't be wandering around in broad daylight unless someone else had a hand in it. Maggie hid the note in the sleeve of her dress. Gwyn was still sitting on the windowsill. Sleepily he stretched his neck and sniffed at the wall outside. Perhaps he could smell the pigeons who sometimes settled outside the window. "Feed him some bread so he won't run away," Maggie whispered to Finoglio. and then went over to the bed and got down her backpack. Where was that pencil? She was sure she had a pencil. Yes, there it was, although it was only a small stump. Now what about paper? She took one of Darius's old books out from under the mattress and carefully tore out one of the end papers. She'd never done such a thing before. Imagine tearing a page out of a book. But now she had to. Alright, I'm sorry, but Finoglio has been hassling her about, you didn't ask for pencil and paper. You forgot to ask for pencil and paper. I need to have pencil and paper. And she had a pencil. And they had access to paper in the form of the end papers from the books. So what the heck are they obsessing about and so upset that she didn't ask for this stuff? You know, if she had a pencil, they could have figured out, you know, something to write on later. But, I'm sorry, but to me that's just one of those little things that it's like, it pulls me slightly out of the story because it just seems so ridiculous to me. Kneeling on the floor, she began to write in the same curly script that Mo had used for his message. She knew the letters by heart. We're all right, and I can do it too, Mo. I read Tinker Bell out of her book, and when it gets dark tomorrow, Capricorn wants me to bring the shadow out of Inkheart to come and kill Dustfinger. She didn't mention Risa. Not a word to show that she thought she had seen her mother, and if Capricorn had his way that she too had only 2 days to live. A message like that wouldn't fit on a piece of paper, no matter how large it was. Gwyn was greedily nibbling the bread Finoglio had given him. Meggie folded up the end paper and tied it to his collar. Take care, she whispered to Gwyn, and then threw the rest of the bread down into Capricorn's yard. The Martins scurried down the wall of the house as if it were the easiest thing in the world. One of the maids screamed as he scampered between her legs and called out to the others. She was probably alarmed for Capricorn's chickens, but Gwyn had already disappeared over the wall. Good, excellent, so your father's here, Finoglio whispered to Meggie, standing beside her by the open window. Somewhere out there, very good indeed, and you'll get the tin soldier back. Who was it who said that all's for the best in this best of all possible worlds? He rubbed the tip of his nose and blinked out at the dazzling sunlight. So the next thing to do, he murmured, is to play on Basta's superstitions. What a good thing I gave him that little weakness. It was a clever move. Meggie had no idea what he was talking about, but that didn't matter to her. She had only one thought in her head. Mo was here. And that's the end of chapter 42. Yeah. So, Meggie has read something out of a book again, proving that it wasn't just a fluke. You know, she does in fact have the gift. And, yeah, it's interesting just how everything is playing out, and I can't wait to see what Mo's reaction to the note is going to be, and what he has planned. Why does Finoglio want the pencil and paper? What does he have planned? And I just hope that everything comes out right in the end. And I hope you have a great day, and I will see you next time.